It is a false dichotomy when people present the choice as being either between America as an idea or America as a hardline ethno-nationalist state. We can say, is a nation state all about, blood and soil, as some folks on the hard right would say? Is being a nation state, such an abstract thing that simply subscribing to a set of ideas or a creed could make you a member of a nation state? This idea of America as a creedal nation is something that has roots, or at least it claims to have roots, back in the Declaration of Independence. But in reality, it's really a much more recent innovation. In this year of our 250th anniversary, it is vitally important that Americans Is America a creedal nation? Are we a country like most other countries defined by a people and a place? Or is America an idea? This is a debate that many conservatives have been having for some time now. And of course, in this, the year of our semi-quincentennial, 250 years since the Declaration of Independence in 1776, this is a question that is on the minds of almost all Americans. Just what kind of a nation are we? On the right, there is a spectrum of opinion. There are some who embrace the idea of a creedal nation. There are others who emphasize the idea that America is a historic nation defined by a history of events and traditions that we've built up over time. And then perhaps on the fringes of the right, there are people who want to make America out to be a purely racial entity or an ethno-nationalist kind of state. The problem, of course, with that third position, there are actually lots of problems with it, but historically one of the problems is that, of course, you have Spanish explorers coming to the Americas and even to North America long before you have the establishment of the English here, and African slaves rather, are brought over to the New World very early on and have ancestry that antedates and that precedes most of the later waves of white immigration to America. So the idea that, of a sort of hard right ethno-nationalist definition of America is a non-starter. And it is a false dichotomy when people present the choice as being either between America as an idea or America as a hardline ethno-nationalist state. Certainly the latter is a false idea. But this idea of America simply as a creedal nation, as America the idea rather than America a people and a place, is also fundamentally flawed and quite dangerous. Now, one of the champions of this idea of America as a creedal nation right now is, in fact, one of America's greatest historians, a man by the name of Gordon Wood. Now, Wood, as I say, is a tremendously skilled scholar. He is a great and widely recognized and admired historian, but he's also a very enthusiastic liberal of a kind of moderate sense. He's not a radical progressive or a leftist, but he is someone who I think would strongly identify with a certain kind of liberalism, and he probably sees himself quite clearly in a tradition established by someone like Thomas Jefferson back in the late 18th century. And while that's, an important component of America's history and America's tradition, and we might even say the American political identity, we're not all Jeffersonians, and Jeffersonianism doesn't define the United States as a whole. And in fact, Gordon Wood himself, when he talks as a historian rather than as a Jeffersonian or liberal, Gordon Wood often points out that some of what we would now assume about the Declaration of Independence really isn't true at all. So the Declaration of Independence was not necessarily seen as being an extremely important document by Americans themselves at the time that it was issued on July 4th, 1776. Americans were busy fighting the Revolutionary War. It was certainly very important that we were declaring independence from Great Britain, but Americans were, as Gordon Wood points out, actually more concerned with what was happening in their own colonies, which had now become independent states. They were very concerned about the fate of the American Confederacy as a whole. That's the America under the Articles of Confederation and with the Continental Congress. But they did not think that the ideas of the Declaration of Independence were the thing that was defining them as a people. And keep in mind that America had a colonial history of about 170 years before we get to the point of declaring our independence from Britain. So the Jamestown colony begins around 1607. Of course, the Declaration of Independence is issued in 1776. In the intervening roughly 170 years, that is the period during which the American colonies acquire their traditions and their sense of who they are as a people or as a set of peoples. The bigger problem, the bigger difficulty confronting people who want to talk about America as a country or America as one people or one nation in the year 1776 is that, of course, Americans had very strong loyalties to their own colonies, which had now become states. Virginians thought of themselves as Virginians first. Massachusetts citizens thought of themselves as Massachusetts. Similarly, Pennsylvanians and others all had very strong loyalties that were locally rooted. And that does not mean they didn't think of themselves also as being Americans. They were using the word American already as a demonym, as a word that described themselves as a people as a whole. But politically speaking, there was certainly a compound loyalty. There was a sense both that they were Americans, that they were fighting for the independence of America, but also that they were very much rooted in their own states and localities. The Declaration of Independence, in fact, makes a considerable point of describing us as one people. This is in the very opening sentences of the Declaration of Independence. In the first paragraph, we are described as one people. Now that's very important because the Declaration of Independence is speaking for America as a whole. It's speaking for the Continental Congress, for all 13 colonies. It's saying basically to the British, you're not going to be able to carve up your rebellious possessions by striking separate deals with the 13 individual states, that in fact they are united as one people and they have a united foreign policy and united diplomacy, and in unison they are declaring independence. The states were also declaring independence one by one. That was happening at the same time, but it's vitally important that the Continental Congress has this meeting, that they issue the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Independence says, yes, there is one people, there is an America, and that the 13 states, they're certainly very important, but they're not all isolated, and they're not to, be considered completely separate, especially in the realm of foreign policy. This, by the way, is something we should keep in mind in thinking about what it means to be a nation state. We can say, is a nation state all about, blood and soil, as some folks on the hard right would say? Is being a nation state, such an abstract thing that simply subscribing to a set of ideas or a creed could make you a member of a nation state? But one thing about a nation state is that it actually involves the defense of a particular piece of land and a defense of that land by a particular people. If you look at both the Declaration of Independence and also at the U.S. Constitution in 1787 and the Federalist Papers that are written in defense of the United States Constitution, you'll notice that foreign policy actually plays a very important role in helping to define America as a nation in all of those documents. In fact, you'll notice that with the Federalist Papers, Federalist numbers 2 through about 12 or so are dedicated to the foreign policy case for America having a stronger central, even national government. That's precisely because to have a nation state, you have to be able to, as the Declaration of Independence indicates, take your status among the equal nations among the, in the world. And that means you have to be able to speak with one voice. It means you have to be able to defend your territory. It means you have to be able, even if you can't win every war, which smaller countries often can't do, you have to be able to present a credible enough defense in order to deter aggressors. And America as a whole, America as a union of the 13 states, America as a nation state is capable of mounting that kind of defense. Whereas if America was forced to think of itself simply as an ad hoc coalition of 13 independent bodies, that would have been a very dangerous condition for, any of those states trying to claim independence, precisely because the British would have been able to pick them off one by one, cut separate deals, make separate arrangements with different states, and break up the Union, and then whatever states wanted to continue to hold out against the British would have been more isolated and more easily defeated. So foreign policy was a prime consideration in helping to make America a nation state. And this was not simply a matter of abstract philosophy taken from John Locke or any other Enlightenment source. This was rather the fact that we had a people who did indeed feel a certain amount of commonality among themselves, and they needed to defend themselves in common as a whole. And of course, the creation of the Continental Army, which was in 1775, means that there is a national institution, an institution in which Americans of all different states are serving and of course, also dying. So we as a nation have, graveyards, and we have monuments and memorials and days of memorial, holidays, which all pay honor to the veterans who have served the country as a whole and who have not simply served one particular state or another individually. Now, this idea of America as a creedal nation is something that has roots, or at least it claims to have roots back in the Declaration of Independence. But in reality, it's really a much more recent innovation. It's something that really comes into being as a strong force in the 20th century, and it becomes progressively stronger during the years of the Cold War. And you can see why that is. During the Cold War, the United States was in competition with, strategic competition with, was fighting, literally a Cold War against the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union explicitly thought of itself as not a nation state, not a people in one particular territory, but rather the Soviet Union was the embodiment of an idea. And that idea was Marxism-Leninism. That idea was the notion that all the different nations of the world would have to eventually dissolve, that the working class was a transnational class, and that it would bring down all these different rival nation states, and instead everyone would embrace socialism, everyone would embrace communism, perhaps even a kind of world government. The Soviet Union itself, by the way, even though we think of the Soviet Union as identical with Russia, at least that's one way in which it's commonly discussed in a kind of casual fashion, the Soviet Union explicitly was not just Russia. The Soviet Union really was a union of socialist republics, which included Russia, but included all the different, SSRs, the different socialist republics that were part of, the Russian orbit. So it was explicitly an anti-nationalist and indeed transnationalist entity, and it was a transnationalist entity that wanted to promote a universal ideology of communism around the entire world. It wanted to bring the entire world to experience a communist revolution that would again abolish all nations, abolish all classes, that would throw religion into the dustbin of history, and that would instead have a new era of, as the Soviets, imagined it, a new era of prosperity, of secularism, of scientific government, and of personal freedom. Marx has some very lyrical passages where he talks about this idea that, after the success of communism, people are going to be free to do whatever they want. They can work for a few hours a day and then they can go fishing, or they can read a book. They can do anything they wish to do. They can be fully fulfilled as individuals because of the freedom that communism is going to give them. Now, of course, all of that was a pack of lies, and that communism in practice winds up being a totalitarian power by a centralized government that is not accountable to the people. And you can see why that is, because in the communist way of thinking, there is no people. There is no Russian people that really matters. It's not the people of the different Soviet socialist republics of the USSR that really matter. Rather, the Soviet Union as a whole is dedicated to an idea. It's dedicated to the idea of communism. And the people, to the extent that they are told that they have to endorse that idea, they might play a role. But you cannot possibly be a Soviet citizen who rejects Marxism-Leninism and still expect to have civil rights and civil liberties and to have a say in government. On the contrary, if you reject the Marxist-Leninist idea, then you are also an enemy of the Soviet state, and you are going to be branded as a criminal. At the very least, you're going to be deprived of the freedom to speak out. You're going to be deprived of the freedom to work. And very possibly you're going to wind up, especially in the earlier years of the Soviet Union, in prison. You're going to wind up in a gulag or otherwise facing very harsh persecution. So a creedal nation and a proposition nation can actually be a very, very terrible thing. It can be totalitarian in the case of an entity like the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, it did have a seat in the United Nations. It did have certain characteristics of being not really a nation in the sense of a people, but certainly a nation in the sense of a state controlling a very large territory and claiming to be a republic. So the Soviet Union was a sort of worst-case scenario of what happens when you have a territory whose government claims that it is defined by an ideology. And keep in mind, the Soviets They believed their ideology was pure science. They believed it was grounded in economics, and they believed it was grounded in human nature, that all human beings wanted to be free from the oppression of bourgeois morality and family and religion, and wanted to be free from the oppression of governments that were serving the cause of capitalism. And so all people everywhere, the Soviets believed, really wanted to be just like the people of the Soviet Union. They wanted to be liberated by communism. This, again, of course, was a pack of lies. It was all based on fundamental misunderstandings of human nature and of reality itself. And yet, this was such a powerful set of beliefs that the Bolshevik Party, which was, a minority party in Russia when it was still controlled by the czars, and then when briefly Russia became a republic under Prime Minister Kerensky, the Bolshevik Party, despite all the disadvantages it was facing and despite being a very small party, passionately believed in this idea. They really believed in, basically the Soviet creed. And they've made that Soviet creed a reality under which their countrymen, in Russia, and then ultimately, of course, not only in Russia, but in the Soviet Union as a larger entity, and in all the conquered nations of Eastern Europe that were subordinate to Russian Soviet power. All these people were oppressed by and told that they had to live under the rules of this ideology, this Soviet creed. Now, an American creed, obviously, would not be as bad as a Soviet creed. And, there are many noble ideas that America has fought for over the centuries, and that America stands for, and that America represents. But if you try to say that America is a creedal nation, there are still some dangers, even though our ideas are much better, of course, than the ideas of the Soviet Union. Hi, I'm Daniel McCarthy, the editor-in-chief of Modern Age. We are going to take a season break with the Modern Age podcast, and we will be back with you in about a month, perhaps with a new format. In the meantime, however, you should check out Modern Age online every weekday at www.modernAgeJournal.com. You can also read Modern Age in print, which is by far the best way to enjoy it. You'll be able to take in long-form essays on the deepest conservative ideas, and the thoughts and philosophies that are most important to America, not only today, but for all time. Read Modern Age in print. It's published quarterly, and you can find out how to subscribe by visiting our website, www.modernAgeJournal.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please continue to hit that like button, share this with your friends, and indeed also check out the website and the works of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is the publisher of Modern Age, and you can visit its website at www.isi.org. Let me talk a little bit more about the Cold War, and especially the end of the Cold War, and why the idea of America as a creedal nation, America as an idea rather than a place and a people, becomes so important. Since the Soviets were our rivals, and the Soviets had this, sort of evangelical socialist set of ideas that they wanted to spread around the world, we felt the need in America, and among our allies too in the West, we felt the need to have a sort of equal and opposite ideology to Soviet globalism and Soviet internationalism. Just as the Soviets said they had an ideology that was progressive and secular and scientific, that was going to be beneficial for the poor, and that was grounded in, sort of wise economics, we in the West and in America, our leaders, our intellectuals and our political leaders, embraced a set of equal and opposite universal ideas. The idea that that capitalism was a kind of equal and opposite reaction answer to communism. The notion that our way of life, our human rights, and our sense of what it meant to be a free people, that these were ideas grounded in Enlightenment ideals, just as the Soviets claimed their ideas were grounded in the Enlightenment. That John Locke basically was going to have the same role in our lives as Karl Marx had in the lives of the Soviets. America was reconstructed, intellectually speaking, during the Cold War era, especially towards the end of the Cold War, along these internationalist ideological lines that would closely align America with, not just a practice of capitalism among ourselves, but the idea of capitalism as a necessary universal value that America was going to be dedicated to and would promote. Similarly, the idea of human rights becomes detached from the context it had during the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, yes, it talks about the natural rights that all men and women have to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the Declaration of Independence talks about those rights and talks about individual people in the context, individuals that is, by themselves. It talks about them in the context of forming a political people, a nation. And that people is then responsible for framing a government that is appropriate to that particular people's desires. And different peoples around the world may have different desires and different objectives. The Declaration of Independence is sometimes misinterpreted by some of the more left-wing or liberal readers today as being a document that is against monarchy, a document that is declaring that there can only be one right form of government for people all around the world. That's not actually what the letter of the Declaration of Independence says. Go back and read it carefully. The Declaration of Independence acknowledges that you can have different forms of government in the world. The Americans have, up until that point, so over the course of 170 years or so, the Americans have been pretty happy to be part of a monarchical government, to be part of a larger sort of international empire that Britain was the heart of, and that the King of England was, responsible for taking care of. The Americans had 170 years to kind of learn how to govern themselves. They had independent legislatures in their own colonies, but then they all acknowledged, and were very happy to acknowledge, the authority of the king in Great Britain. They even celebrated George III when he first took the throne. So in 1760, George III becomes king. The Americans see this as an occasion for celebration, and they go on to continue to celebrate the anniversary of the king's coronation practically every year, up until you get to the point of the Revolution and independence. So the Americans were not, unhappy with monarchy. The Americans didn't think that other nations were supposed to overthrow their monarchies either. Think about this. One of the contexts in which the Declaration of Independence is very important is that this allows America as a whole to start negotiating with other foreign countries to support us in our Revolutionary War. So, in other words, thanks to the Declaration of Independence and now having colonies that are united with one voice as one people, we can go to the French and we can go to the Spanish and the Dutch and say, we are the Americans, we are a serious entity, we have some capacity to defend ourselves, we have a capacity to handle our finances, and we would like you to help us fight against the British and free ourselves from George III and his parliament. Now, Spain had a monarchy. France very much had a monarchy. France, in fact, was kind of legendary for having a very powerful, even absolute monarchy. And Louis XVI was not as powerful as, his ancestor Louis XIV had been, but Louis XVI was still a much more powerful monarch than George III was. And yet, we Americans were very happy to have Louis XVI on our side during the Revolutionary War. And after the Revolutionary War, after we have severed our ties with England and Britain and with George III, well, you might think, well, that means Americans are no longer going to celebrate any royal coronations or birthdays, right? But you'd be wrong, because in fact, between the American Revolution and then the eventual French Revolution, Americans very often had big celebrations celebrating the birthday of Louis XVI of France. So in other words, they transferred their affection for the idea of a great patriot king, a great monarch that would help the cause of liberty. They transferred that from George III before the American Revolution onto Louis XVI after the American Revolution. But again, there is this mythology which liberals have constructed, which says that the Declaration of Independence was intended to discredit all monarchs, and that it was intended to announce, a sort of worldwide revolution, not just an American revolution, but a worldwide movement in favor of a certain kind of republicanism. Now, obviously, that doesn't even make sense in the context of the time of 1776. Would it have made any sense at all to go to Louis XVI, the King of France, show him our Declaration of Independence, say, okay, this means we can now accredit our own ambassadors, that, we are not 13 chaotic states, that may or may not have international relations with France or Spain or other countries. We are now a nation state of our own that can have diplomatic relations on a one-to-one basis with France. Would that have made sense if indeed we were presenting Louis XVI with a document that claimed kings are all illegitimate? That would be crazy. The King of France would have looked at that and said, even if I like the fact that you Americans are fighting the British, who are my old enemies, I can't possibly support you if you are supporting this idea of a global revolution against all kings, including myself. The Declaration of Independence doesn't do that. It was not intended to do that. The Declaration of Independence does say that a people does choose its form of government. A people, by the way, being a very near synonym to a nation. A people or a nation does choose its frame of government. It chooses that frame of government in order to preserve and sort of enjoy its rights to the utmost. But it is the choice of that people what kind of government they're going to have, and it's the choice of that people as to how their rights are going to be defended by and promoted by whatever frame of government they choose. That's very important. That is a key component of the American project, both for ourselves, but also in saying, to the extent there is a universal principle involved here, it is a principle that peoples can choose different forms of government with their own different objectives. Governments do need to be, respectful of the rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And the fact that pursuit of happiness can mean so many different things to different peoples is one of the strengths of the Declaration of Independence. It is not saying everyone has to pursue happiness in the same way as we ourselves as Americans might do. But as I say, in the context of the Cold War, America was fighting against not a separate nation state, but rather an internationalist and indeed globalist universal ideology, which claimed to be speaking for humanity everywhere. The Soviet Union and the communist cause claimed to be speaking in favor of the working classes in every country, whether or not the working classes actually voted for communists, whether or not they lived in free countries or in communist countries. The Soviets claimed that the working class everywhere was the class that deserved to rule, and was the class, that gave the communists themselves the authority to rule. Now, that didn't require an election. The communists claimed that they could exert authority over all of mankind, over all of humanity, because the communists claimed they had a scientific understanding of human nature, including its economic side, and what that human nature required in order to be fulfilled. So even if workers, had false consciousness, which meant that they weren't supporting communist parties in their own countries, the communists nevertheless saw themselves as authorized to speak on behalf of the working class for all of humanity, because the communists claimed that they alone had the correct, enlightened scientific knowledge about universal human nature and the universal order that is brought about by Marxist economics. Well, unfortunately, during the Cold War, Americans embraced an exactly parallel kind of ideology. So you had a set of intellectuals in America. Some of them were human rights lawyers, some of them were economists, some of them had other kinds of backgrounds. But you have a cadre of intellectuals in our universities, in our government, in our media, who come up with this idea that, in fact, they are, in a sense, authorized to exert power, even over the American people themselves, because these are the intellectuals who best understand human nature and the economy. Now, they're thinking of a free market economy, not a communist socialist economy, and they have a somewhat different idea of human nature, although, strangely enough, many American liberals, and this includes, unfortunately, a lot of free market classical liberals, they do ultimately, at the end of the day, have an understanding of human nature which is very similar to Karl Marx's, in that they often put a great emphasis on economics and utility rather than deeper spiritual, needs of humanity. And they think that the ultimate fulfillment of human nature is a kind of personal autonomy in which we can just go and do whatever we want, follow whatever passions we might have, to exert whatever lifestyle choices we wish to make. Just as the communists believed in that ultimately, so too did many American liberals and libertarians, and that includes both, again, free market liberals as well as statist, big government liberals, and indeed, sort of progressives and socialists. There's this very large coalition on the American left during the Cold War, and it even has some exponents, on the center right in America during the Cold War, which says America is an idea, just as the Soviet Union is an idea. The American idea is very similar to the Soviet idea in that it's about economics and it's about the fulfillment of human nature. But the difference is that our economics are capitalist instead of communist, and we have the same idea of human nature, but a different idea of what kinds of paternal governments are necessary in order to fulfill that nature. The paternalism, by the way, was very similar among liberal elites during the Cold War and communist elites, on the other side. In that, just as the communists believed that they didn't need to win an election in order to speak for all the people of the world and in order to speak for the working class, because again, they understood, based on their supposedly scientific economic knowledge of human nature and the activity of our economy, the communists claimed that they therefore could speak for what was really in the best interests, and indeed what was really ultimately privately deeply desired by the working classes and by all of humanity. Well, unfortunately, in the West, many of our intellectuals and many of our political leaders had the same kind of hubris. They claimed that we, as enlightened, capitalist, and exponents of a liberal idea of human rights, we understand human nature and we understand what human beings all around the world desire. When we say that America is an idea or America is a creedal nation, that has profound implications for the question of who is an American. And what it winds up doing is reducing the significance of American citizenship and increasing the significance of this ideology. It starts to imply that if you hold to this ideology, this notion of, all human beings aspire to fulfillment as understood by capitalist economics, all human beings aspiring to the liberal idea of fulfilling their nature as human beings, which would be a choice in not only consumer products, but a choice even in looking at your own identity as a kind of consumer product, where you have a smorgasbord of different religions and sexual orientations and other kinds of identities to choose from. Just as the Soviets, used their set of ideologies to claim that they could speak for all of humanity, at the end of the Cold War, there were Western liberals and libertarians too, unfortunately, who claimed that they were now speaking for all of humanity. All of humanity aspired to basically the same values as liberals in America and in Western Europe. They aspired to prosper according to the rules of international global capitalism. They aspired to have the lifestyle choices that liberals have in the United States and in Western Europe. And that raises a question. What if, just as the Soviets, just as the communists, were very disappointed when it turned out that working classes all around the world were very nationalist, very patriotic, very religious. Think of the importance that the Catholic faith played in Poland in resisting the power of communism. Just as the communists were very, very disappointed that this wonderful Enlightenment system of economics and fulfillment of human nature that the communists believed in, just as the patriotic and religious sentiments of the working class and of actual voters in parts of all around the world was an obstacle to the creation of this global international communist order. Well, the same thing happens when it comes to the desire of American liberals to build a liberal international order. It turns out that when people actually get the vote, whether it's in Western Europe or whether it's in other parts of the world, the developing world, ordinary voters do not endorse the universal values of liberalism. Ordinary voters actually think of themselves as a particular people in a particular place. They want to look out for the national interest. They want to look out for the sort of economic national interest of their own neighbors and people like themselves in their own countries, their fellow citizens. They do not endorse the internationalist plans of global free trade and all the international organizations that are responsible for managing global free trade. Similarly, when people get to actually have a say on their own government, they don't want to have open borders. They do not want to have mass immigration on the scale that liberals want to have it. It turns out that people actually want to have a somewhat closed citizenship, and they do not want to endorse this notion that anyone anywhere in the world can become a European or an American simply by embracing a set of ideas, simply by being ambitious to make a lot of money, simply by being willing to engage in commerce, and simply by endorsing a liberal view of human nature and human rights. When voters get to have their say, they vote for nationalism, for patriotism, and for religion. And this, just as it was a disappointment for communist internationalists, this has been a bitter disappointment for America's own liberal internationalists, for those who say that America is a creedal nation, for those who say that America is an idea and not a people and a place. They are angry that American voters want to support less immigration, that American voters are willing to support candidates who want to back away from free trade, want to have more protectionism, more economic nationalism. Then they're also angry that that voters, especially in America, don't support wars that are designed to promote this liberal international order and the dissolution of individual national sovereignties into a global system. This idea of an American creed is something of an imposter. That in fact, this American creed is not about America. It's not about saying that America is a creedal nation. It's rather saying that the creed is transnational. It's global. It is very much identical with, economic theory itself, with a certain form of capitalism, and it's very much identical with a liberal creed, a liberal understanding of human nature and what it takes to fulfill that nature. And because actual voters who are too patriotic, too nationalistic, too religious to cooperate with this enlightened blueprint for elevating all of humanity, liberals do not like voters being able to vote. They do not like populist movements. They don't like them in Europe. They don't like them in the United States. Liberals they have tried to hijack the word democracy to mean democracy is anything that promotes their creed. Anything that promotes the liberal creed is democracy. And if it doesn't do that, then, even if voters are getting their say, that's not democracy, because voters, again, just as the Soviets believed, voters had false consciousness that led them not to accept the glory of international communist scientific theory. So too, liberals in the West believe that voters have false consciousness, that they're too ignorant, they can't make decisions for themselves, and therefore smarter people who have a enlightened scientific understanding of universals, including economic universals in particular, they're the ones who should be making policy decisions. And democracy should really just be a way of approving after the fact what the elites have already decided. So democracy, according to these liberals, becomes something of a sham, just as democracy was always a sham when the Soviet Union would have elections. All the people of the Soviet Union, the peoples of the Soviet Union could possibly do is endorse what the Politburo had already decided for them. That's because, when actual peoples get the vote in their own countries, they tend to choose to vote in a patriotic, nationalistic, and oftentimes a very religious way, which is in conflict with these competing ideas that are secular, that are universalistic, that are anti-nationalistic, that see patriotism as a kind of bigotry, or indeed that see patriotism and nationalism as identical with fascism. There are liberals who believe that, just as there are communists who believe that. They both really dislike and are very uncomfortable with patriotism, a defense of one's own land, a defense of one's own history and citizenry. They instead want you to fight and die only for universal abstractions that are championed and formulated by elites, whether those are liberal elites or communist elites. So a creedal nation is a rather dangerous idea, even if the elements of the creed, the items in the creed, are much better in the West or much better in America than they are, in the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of communism. One of the problems is precisely that this kind of understanding of the American creed as a set of universal ideas leads to the destruction of American self-government. It leads to elites believing that they should overrule and try to prevent the people from having a say in their own government, again, because the people are ignorant and the people suffer from false consciousness. And really what the people desire, what all people desire, what human nature requires for its fulfillment, is what the liberals are prescribing, and what they understand as being justice, what they understand as being the good. And so you have this sort of tragedy where many liberals now are shocked that, they thought at the end of the Cold War, their universal system had prevailed against a rival universal system represented by communism. Really, their view of the Cold War is that it was actually a civil war between two varieties of progressivism: liberal progressivism in the West, communist progressivism in the Eastern Bloc. And both of these were progressive in that they were secular. They claimed to base their authority on science, and they claimed to be looking to fulfill human nature and human rights in the absence of any deeper metaphysics, certainly in the absence of any, dependency on God. The Declaration of Independence, of course, does depend on God. It says all men are endowed with these rights by their creator. If you take away, you can't endow anything if there's no one to do the endowing. So the Declaration of Independence is not a secular liberal document. It may be, its commitment to religion, its commitment to theism may be very vague. It may not be a fully Christian document. It might be somewhat theistic or deistic, however you might want to frame it. It might be a kind of Unitarian document in some sense. But it certainly does depend on God, and a God that takes an active role in giving human beings their rights. That the Soviet Union and later notions of human rights in other kinds of political contexts do not depend upon. Basically, Americans have been tricked by liberals into substituting the true principles of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence for a set of secular liberal principles which are much more akin, in a weird way, to the economistic and utilitarian aiming at personal autonomy ideals that characterize the old Soviet Union than the notions that had actually been in the minds of our own founding fathers. The bridge between these two sets of ideas is unfortunately a transformation of Thomas Jefferson's own ideology. So Thomas Jefferson, of all the American founding fathers, he is the one who is most enamored of this experiment in total revolution that takes place in France a decade after the American Revolution. And Jefferson is, he is in some ways very sympathetic to the far left, the Jacobins in France, those who say, you know what, you can't possibly have monarchy, you can't have mixed government, you have to have, their version of republicanism, and of course, or democracy. And of course, their version of republicanism and democracy is not, let the people have their vote, and if the people vote for having a king, or if the people vote for having closed borders, that's okay. No, the French revolutionaries come to believe that the people themselves, cannot be democratic even when they vote, because they suffer from this false consciousness. They suffer from, all of the religious education that they've acquired. And until you have eradicated the lingering effects of Christianity, the lingering effects of, a social hierarchy, the lingering effects of inequality, until you have eradicated the lingering psychological effects of all of that traditional background on ordinary individuals, individuals will not be free enough to be able to vote for themselves responsibly in an election. And in the meantime, the educated and enlightened elites who have liberated themselves from Christianity and from social hierarchy and from tradition of all kinds, they must be the masters of society who are going to dictate the direction of government. Jefferson was a very complicated figure, and in many respects, he did have, a true devotion to the people, but that was in conflict with this, set of very enlightened universalistic ideas that he also was very much enamored of. And Jefferson, you find both of those sets of ideas in tension among him. If you then go later, you find that other people who start to take their inspiration in decades that follow from Thomas Jefferson are often taking more and more of their inspiration from this left-wing version of Thomas Jefferson. There is a more and a less left-wing version of Thomas Jefferson in Jefferson himself. Over time, first of all, Jefferson is exploded and expanded to become the entirety of the American tradition, when in fact he was only one voice among many, along with Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, James Madison, and so many others, many of whom, had were very strongly opposed to the French Revolution. But Jefferson is misremembered, especially by the liberal mythology that we're all propagandized with. Jefferson is misremembered as having been sort of the embodiment of America as a whole, from the Revolutionary War all the way through to his own presidency. John Adams in particular really disagreed with that. Jefferson was selected to write the Declaration of Independence not because the Continental Congress considered him to be a philosopher king who needed to give, all the Americans a new set of ideas that would now define them. Rather, they simply thought Jefferson is an eloquent writer, and he will, speak for the general, ideas that we as a people have already adopted and embraced. The people came before the Declaration of Independence. They came before Jefferson's articulation of those ideas. And so to speak of America as a creedal nation is false. It is even quite dangerous because it tends to create a severance, a gulf, an abyss between America's intellectual and political elites on the one hand and American voters on the other. Those voters understand what it means to be an American much better than the elites do. They understand it much better than Gordon Wood does, unfortunately. As much as I respect Gordon Wood as a historian, as a political philosopher, he is very inadequate. And he has, sort of, even though he's not an extreme liberal, he has nonetheless taken it for granted that the kind of liberalism that developed during his own time, he's in his 90s now, so he lived throughout the Cold War. He was growing into maturity as a scholar in the heyday of the Cold War. And his scholarship reflects that. He's very much a believer in these kinds of universal conflicts. And he has this image of America as a kind of mirror image of the Soviet Union, as being this universalistic idea which the entire world is expected to embrace. Think about some of the consequences, though, that notion of America as an idea, as a creedal nation have had. It's used to justify mass immigration. It's used to say that, someone who is not an American citizen, but who aspires to be, an entrepreneur and a businessman, someone who, loves the Statue of Liberty and wants to talk about human rights, that person is really an American and is maybe even a better American than our own native citizens. You can look at, an organization like the Cato Institute and see that, it constantly has a contemptuous picture that it presents of native-born Americans. It doesn't like American citizens. It wants, rather, to get rid of the idea of American citizenship and American borders and instead say that everyone all around the world should be an American and in a sense kind of already is an American. And this notion of a creedal Americanism, it gets constantly, it's one thing when people present it as being, if someone's really devoted to these ideas of American history, then that means they are already an American, even if they don't have citizenship, and they should be allowed to live here, even as illegal immigrants. Well, that might seem at least a very, restrictive definition, as long as it involves, being a successful entrepreneur, being, someone who's very well versed in the American founding, very dedicated to the Declaration of Independence, maybe memorizing the Declaration of Independence. But of course, most of the mass migration that we have consists of people who have not memorized the Declaration of Independence. They are not particularly devoted to any set of, philosophical ideas, including the American creed. And while they certainly do want to come here and make money, it is not that they are necessarily going to be brilliant entrepreneurs. Nevertheless, those who endorse the idea of a creedal nation say that they still, any person who's coming here to make money, any person who's coming here simply to enjoy having rights, that is enough to qualify them as an American. And again, you therefore, should go easy on illegal immigration. Maybe you should have open borders. Maybe you should just have mass migration on a huge scale. In foreign policy, this idea of a creedal nation leads to the disasters that we've seen in Iraq and so many other wars of the early 21st century. Keep in mind the kind of rhetoric that President George W. Bush employed as he was talking about going to war with Iraq. The idea that George W. Bush presented was that the only thing preventing the Iraqis from having the kind of lives that we Americans have was the fact that they had a dictator who needed to be deposed, and that once Saddam Hussein was out of the way, the Iraqi people would aspire to exactly the same sort of values that we Americans, or at least liberal Americans, endorse and enjoy. That the Iraqis would want, to have free market capitalism. They'd want to have, global corporations, American corporations come in and, take root in their land. They would want to have, American-style lifestyle choices. They'd want to have feminism and LGBTQ ideas. All that would be, would find a fertile soil in Iraq, just as it found a fertile soil in America, especially in higher education. Well, that was false. Similarly, we spent 20 years trying to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy. And while the Afghan people might not want to be ruled by theocrats like the Taliban, nevertheless, they also did not want to embrace and were not willing to fight and die for the values that America tried to export to Afghanistan. They did not want to, they certainly might want a greater degree of freedom for women, but they don't want, the West's understanding of what freedom for women requires. The West is still delusional about the popularity of its own version of liberalism and its own version of lifestyle choices and how popular those notions are, all around the world. And again, American liberals think it really doesn't matter, because even if right now Afghans or Iraqis, or for that matter, welders in the former East Germany or people anywhere else in the world, even if they don't know that they really want to have, the ability to be a biological male, but to now declare themselves a female, even if they don't know that that's what they truly deeply want, the liberal intellectuals in America think we understand human nature better. We know that actually all people really do want to have the choice in terms of what gender they're going to be, or to be able to say that they are a gender that is not biologically their own, but they're the opposite sex, or maybe no sex. Maybe there are in fact a multiplicity of genders. This kind of insanity, which, there's no other word for it, this kind of insanity which has taken root among elite American liberals is something most of the rest of the world rejects. It's something that most Americans reject. It's something that most people in Western Europe reject. And yet American liberals are confident that they know better than individuals themselves what they really want and what they really need. And the liberal endorsement of a global economic system is basically saying that we know that because all people want to get rich, all people just want to have cheap consumer products, people do not want to have, a kind of national economy. They instead want to simply be individuals who are participating in a global economy. Because liberals have that sense of how people are not really economically part of a nation, they're just economically individuals who are part of the entire world. Therefore, there should be a global economic system which should be regulated and controlled by enlightened liberals who understand the principles of free market economics. And this is, of course, why liberals really despise any kind of economic nationalism. They despise tariffs or protectionism or anything that looks out for America's own economic national interests, because they say there is no such thing as a nation in economics. Economics is only about individuals, and of course, all individuals taken together, which is the world. Well, look, our founding documents, our Declaration of Independence does talk about one people. It does take for granted the idea that there is an American nation, and that America as a nation should be able to set its own economic policies. Sometimes those will involve trade with other countries. Sometimes they will involve tariffs. The Americans, in fact, were fighting to have the right to govern themselves as a people, as a nation, politically, in their economic relations with other nations and other peoples. So in this year of our 250th anniversary, it is vitally important that Americans rediscover the truth about their tradition, rediscover, the fact that they have a very rich history that not only goes back to a Declaration of Independence, which says things that are very different from what people like Gordon Wood say that they mean, but in fact that we even have a longer tradition of another 170 years before the Declaration of Independence, which is part of our American heritage as well, and it's part of all Americans' heritage, not only the people who are direct descendants of the colonists of, the 17th and 18th centuries, but also Americans who are part of the American family by adoption, by naturalization, whose ancestors may have come over here long after the Mayflower, whose ancestors may have come over here maybe the day before yesterday. They too should appreciate and understand and identify with American tradition and history going back not only to the Declaration of Independence, but long before that as well, to the colonial period. That obviously doesn't mean that everyone wants to be a Puritan or everyone wants to be a kind of Jamestown Virginian. No, but it does mean that is part of our, part of what makes us Americans as well, is that history. In modern age, we've recently had an article by a young writer named Zachary Yost, who touched upon these questions of a creedal nation versus a historic nation, a nation that has had traditions that it has grown to love over centuries, and that needs to continue to perpetuate those traditions, that needs to teach rising generations what it means to be an American. Is not simply an idea, it's not simply wanting to make money in a free market, it's not simply a commitment to some sort of global notion of human rights, but rather it's an understanding of who we are as a people, as a self-governing people with a nation-state of our own.